These are not establishment hacks by any means. And so when they come out and say, look, based on what we have, we can't go forward with any indictments. Also, based on what we have, we think that he killed himself. I'd take that to me, that's credible enough to think that they're probably right. I don't see any reason why they'd be lying to me about that.
I want to ask about the Epstein files. Trump and lots of people in the MAGA world promised that they were going to release these Epstein files. And there seems to be some disappointment in the Attorney General and in the FBI for not saying that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered and for not releasing his so-called client list, which they say doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, I think that, people had their expectations set a little bit too high on this front. And I think you need to start with the presumption. If you're a Trump supporter, you should start with the presumption that people like Dan Bongino and Kash Patel are acting in good faith. I think they've earned that over a number of years. Kash was a person who uncovered a ton of what was going on in Russiagate. Dan has been a longtime podcaster and a firm friend of the Trump movement, didn't need to take the job as deputy director of the FBI. He was making millions as a podcaster. I start with the presumption that those guys are acting in good faith. These are not establishment hacks by any means. And so when they come out and say, look, based on what we have, we can't go forward with any indictments. Also, based on what we have, we think that he killed himself. I'd take that to me, that's credible enough to think that they're probably right. I don't see any reason why they'd be lying to me about that. And I think people who are disappointed or feel there's some sort of flip-flop are not understanding what the difference is now that they're in the FBI versus before when they were just podcast guests. Like when you're a podcast guest, you can make any claim you want to, and you can say, that's probably true, and you can just make it. Nobody cares. When you're a high-ranking official in the FBI, not only are you bound by FBI policies about not casting aspersions on people if you're not going to indict them, but you're also in a position where everything you say, the Senate can call you in and ask you questions about what you said under oath. So there's a sort of a fundamental constraint on like, okay, now it's not just like what speculative things might I want to say or what's my best guess here, but rather what can we prove? What can we establish? What could we charge? And, so as a result, I think that's what you're seeing, that, whatever happened, there's two possibilities here, basically, or three, really. There's possibility one, which is that people's conspiracy theories about what happened with Epstein and including people like me who thought that there was widespread criminality. Maybe the criminality was actually limited to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. That's a possibility that I don't think people are really weighting properly. That's a possibility. Another possibility is there is widespread criminality, but the evidence was destroyed prior to Dan and Kash and all them getting in. So whatever list there is, that's not there. And then the third possibility is Dan and Kash and Pam are all in on a cover-up. And I think that's the least probable of the outcomes. I think that even if you're inclined to think that this is a broader conspiracy implicating a lot of wealthy, powerful people, well, this is conduct that happened 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago. So there's been 3 or 4 presidencies to get rid of files. The idea that there'd be files laying around for Kash and Dan to just grab and be like, aha, we've got them. It strikes me as unlikely. So that's where I'm coming from. I think these people are operating in good faith. There's some possibility that really the criminality is limited to Maxwell and Epstein. There's some possibility that there's broader criminality, but the evidence of that is not available to Kash and Dan. In either of those outcomes, I think Kash and Dan are telling the truth. They don't possess evidence necessary to bring charges. And they certainly are not in a position to just release the list of people that they're not indicting, because that violates DOJ policy, which is not to cast aspersions on people they're not indicting.
There's this clip on Fox News of Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, saying that she has the Epstein client list on her desk. Now, there's been, I think, some confusion over the semantics of this particular clip. The White House are claiming that she wasn't saying she literally had the Epstein client list on her desk. She had the kind of file around Epstein. What do you think of this clip, which is being used by a lot of people like Tucker Carlson and others to suggest that Pam Bondi, she is now part of some kind of cover-up?
I take her at her word now, because having done a lot of TV interviews, it's very easy to either misspeak or mishear, right? She's probably thinking to herself, yes, I have this file that I need to review on my desk, right? If it's a list, you don't need to review a list. A list is a page long. If it's a file, when she's thinking about, I have a file to review, that's hundreds of pages. So I think that makes the most sense in context. I think it also makes sense in the context of other things she was saying about other files that she was reviewing. So, I take her at her word, and I think, when you're actually looking at what are people going to stand by, what's the comment that you should take as like, this is the definitive statement. It's the formal written release that goes through review rather than the off-the-cuff response to an interviewer question.
There's some other questions around this case which seems bizarre. First of all, there's this minute missing from this 10-hour-long video, allegedly, of outside Jeffrey Epstein's cell before he committed suicide, and people were questioning, where's this missing minute that the DOJ released this massive file? So they're asking about that, but also the question around sort of who else was involved with the kind of child trafficking and things like that on Jeffrey Epstein Island. Can this really be limited to just Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell? It seems unlikely with all the connections that he had. So do you accept there are still some questions around this that are unanswered?
I mean, there are questions that are certainly unanswered. I think the missing minute, Pam Bondi said something along the lines of, that's just something they had every single night at the penitentiary because they were rolling over the tape. Given what Bongino said, and given also like friends I've talked to who are not necessarily unfriendly to speculation, but who have worked in prisons, my friend who worked in a prison was like, no, he killed himself, because they just see prison suicides all the time. And if you think about it, the guy lived an extraordinarily decadent life and was facing down life in prison as a pedophile, which is not a pleasant place to be in an American prison. You get treated as the worst of the worst by other inmates. So it's not really beyond speculation that he'd want to kill himself at that point. And the real question is, is there other criminality? I mean, on the one hand, you have a lot of people who've made trips to that island. On the other hand, you got to think that there's another possibility here, which is just Epstein and Maxwell were doing the trafficking themselves, and that Epstein didn't broach it to his other powerful and wealthy friends because he perhaps was worried that he'd get caught, or worried that they would that would get around that that's what he was doing. It's hard to say that we know the actual outcome here. I think I guess my big meta point would be, I think people are wildly overconfident about the truth of the conspiracy theory. And it's like, I think a rational way to look at it is, it's like, there's some probability that the most, catastrophic and nefarious conspiracy theory is true. But there's also this other probability, which is actually either, that there's criminal conduct that was just limited to Maxwell and Epstein. That's the stuff that was proven in a court and alleged. And there's been a lot of lawsuits. I mean, there's been very high-powered law firms that have looked into this, and it's gone nowhere in terms of suing people. So, maybe that's just what happened.
It's funny, this issue seems to have driven a wedge between MAGA, particularly online influencers who've been talking about Epstein for a long time. And one of the things another kind of conspiracy angle that they come up with is that Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad agent, and therefore, this is part of the reason that the Trump administration is potentially covering up some of his crimes, is because he had evidence about Israel and Israeli members of the government and things like that. What do you make of this theory?
I mean, they're not covering up his crimes because he's dead and he was indicted under indictment. So, like, what is the crimes? My understanding is the crimes they would be covering up are the crimes of third parties, right? And so it would be those third parties who would be implicated, and those who would have an interest. And the third parties wouldn't be the Mossad. They would be the high, wealthy, and powerful people who were allegedly blackmailed through this. I think it's another one of those cases where people immediately go to, and then it's not merely that they're making a speculation that there's an intelligence agency involved. They're making a specific speculation about the specific intelligence agency involved, which adds a whole nother layer of probability. It's like, how do you know it was Mossad and not CIA? How do you know it was CIA and not MI5 or MI6? Like, you don't. You're just making stuff up. And the theory is, it's like, I think the theory goes something like, well, Galan's dad was allegedly Mossad. It's like, well, Galan's Galan. How do you know that Galan is going to view the world the exact same way as her dad does? Maybe she's working for British intelligence. How do you? I mean, assuming at all that any of these people are intelligence, right? You have to. I think people are way too aggressive in terms of the confidence in their predictions, and especially about specific facts. Which adds layers of improbability on top of their predictions.
It's interesting how some of these conspiracies can arise. I mean, you could say Tucker Carlson's dad was involved in the CIA and therefore he's a CIA asset. And I know that a lot of, online people probably to the right of Tucker Carlson genuinely believe that. So it does seem that the MAGA world is slightly entrenched in some of these conspiracies. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, is if Tucker's going to go with this claim, why don't we claim that this whole plot to stir up Epstein drama is actually a CIA plot to split the MAGA movement and return the left to power? And it's like, well, you're the son of a CIA agent. Clearly, you're obviously working for the CIA, right? We don't need to think about the fact that you're your own person. You're just a CIA plant. Like that's the kind of. I mean, we could do this all day. The point is, I think that everybody should come down a little bit and actually sit and think not. What did we believe 5 years ago, the moment he died, but rather, given what we know now, and given the fact that we've gotten our own guys into the FBI, guys that, if you were talking about it ex ante, who would you want to go into the FBI to get to the truth of this? People like Dan Bongino, people who can't be bought, people who've got $1 million podcast businesses, and they've gone in there and they said, guys, there's less here. There's no evidence laying around, and also I'm pretty sure the guy just killed himself. It's like that. Okay, given that. Maybe, I think it's a Keynes quote. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Right? Like you have to have the humility to say, especially with a theory, maybe there are facts that would disprove or undermine the probability that theory is true.
Just finally, coming to Trump's reaction to this whole thing. I know that Elon has made some really bizarre allegations around Trump and the Epstein files, and again, that's another layer of conspiracy, but he said it without any evidence. Trump, when I think he was in a cabinet meeting, he was asked about, or Pam Bondi was asked about the Epstein files, and Trump intervened and said, why are you asking about this? We've got floods going on in Texas, there's lots more important things. You're still basically banging on about this guy who died years ago who's a creep. What do you make of Trump's reaction of that clip? Again, people are creating conspiracies just from his reaction.
I'm sympathetic to it. I mean, just think logically, we've got 160 kids or something like that who just died in Texas in flooding. I mean, the stories are horrific. That's a lot of children. And we've got, that's happening right now. Trump has so many other more pressing issues than the potential follow-on prosecutions from the prosecution of a guy who was indicted and died in his first term in office. And again, if these files were around, did the DOJ then hide them too? I mean, at a certain point, you have to be willing to accept, look, this is what we have, and move on. And I mean, that doesn't even mean you have to stop believing that maybe the underlying conspiracy theory isn't true and that people are getting away with it because the evidence was destroyed. But rather, I think if the evidence was destroyed, that sucks. But there's not a lot that the Trump people can really do about that. I mean, maybe you need to give Pam Bondi another 18 months, but whatever it is, certainly if you do think that there is more criminal conduct to uncover, which I'm not even sure of at this point, but if you do think there is on this front, well, it's now got to require a very serious and diligent investigation to acquire new facts to replace the evidence that clearly is no longer in FBI files.
It does seem that there are a lot of expectations coming into the second Trump administration with not just the Epstein files, but all sorts of other files, the JFK stuff, and others. And that hasn't really been lived up to. So perhaps this is more about disappointment that some of these conspiracies are either not true or the government just doesn't hold those files, or I don't know. It just seems like there's a lot of disappointment coming around.
I think there's been some JFK releases, haven't there? I mean,
there
maybe not
been,
as people.
But the question is,
wanted.
Does the JFK releases show that he was shot by someone else? Do you see what I mean? It doesn't prove, what they've released doesn't prove any kind of conspiracy.
Well, maybe that's the evidence wasn't there to prove a conspiracy theory, right? There was a joke on Twitter. I saw somebody that's a pretty old one. Somebody shows up at the pearly gates and God's like, you have one question. And he's like, okay, who killed JFK? And God's like, well, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And the guy's like, man, this conspiracy goes deeper than I thought. Right? At a certain point, you got to take maybe that's just what happened. Maybe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And they can be they're being pretty fulsome, I think, especially with the Epstein stuff. There's only so fulsome they can be. A lot of these files are child pornography, right? Like, you can't just release the video of the guy having sex with a teenager. That's horrific, especially if that teenager is still alive. So, there's constraints on what they can do. And, the funny thing is, my wife worked in the Florida state government, and they did a big release of Epstein files. But every single thing they do was reviewed by legal very, very carefully. Every public statement, every release, there was a ton of legal review, because it's not merely that there's the sensitivity of the victims, but it's also the sensitivity of every statement you make could be potentially defamatory. Like, you're talking about very, very serious matters, and if you make the wrong allegation, like, you're defaming someone in the most serious and devastating way. So, yeah, people are going to be careful with this stuff about how they release files, and that's just the nature of the crimes that are being alleged.